Okay, welcome back. I have just a few stories that I want to unload on you. I think these are very telling, and they provide a lot of background and I want to say wisdom. I had a broker give me a call, and besides being a real estate broker, he invests in properties himself. Not a surprise, but he had at the time, I guess he had about 10 of them. And he called me up and he says, I've got a renter who's calling and complaining that there is mold in her home. And he says, if there's mold, I want to take care of it, but if she's just being crazy, I want to know that too. So I went in with him into the home, and I looked around, and the walls were clean. There wasn't any roof leaking going on. It didn't look like there was any sprinkler spray in the home. The plumbing was doing okay, and I looked around. I just didn't see a sign of mold. So I looked at her and I said, well, how do you know you have mold? And she says, well, my face tingles, so I know I have mold. I had to gently and respectfully let her know that mold is an inhalation thing. And if mold's going to bother you, it's going to bother your breathing tracts, your nose, all of this that's going on. But what mold is not is something that's going to make her face tingle. So, at the time that was hard for me to keep a straight face and to be respectful and let her know that whatever was making her face tingle, it wasn't mold. Another story, and this one actually comes from a fellow home inspector who, of course, I do not respect, and shortly you'll find out why. I was talking to this guy one day, and he was big into mold remediations. He would go into houses, find mold, sometimes I'll add that story to the list, find mold in places and say, okay, you've got mold, and then he would suggest himself and his brother-in-law to remediate the mold. So then his earnings from this particular house would go from $300 or $400 for the inspection to $4,000 or $5,000 for the inspection and the remediation. He didn't have a good reputation, and the more of these sorts of shenanigans he played, the worse his reputation got. So apparently he had to make as much money as he could from the few places where he could make it. He told me that he had a sister-in-law in Texas where he said a mold spore landed on her nose and it ate her nose away. And I didn't respect this guy enough to tell him that mold is a lung irritant, and what it is not is a flesh-eating bacteria. Flesh-eating bacteria are certainly out there, but they're not molds, they're bacteria. You've got that sort of misinformation going on out there. This same individual, he got into an attic and he saw what he called mold. And again, he came down and he recommended himself and his cousin to do a mold remediation on the mold in the attic. So there's two problems here. One is that mold in the attic is not necessarily in the living space, and unless that water gets down into where it can create molds in the living space, that's basically exterior air. That's objection number one. Objection number two is bigger than that. I was asked to go in and verify that we actually had mold. And what this guy was calling mold was actually, I want to call it pine tar. It looks like honey. It's actually fir tar, but you get the idea. It looks a little bit like honey droplets, and they were all over, and this is not a surprise in a attic sort of environment because they get hot up there and that tar can come out. But this home inspector, who'd been doing a lot of work for a lot of people and claiming himself to be the awesomest home inspector in town, he was looking at this fir tar and calling it mold, and then recommending that he and his cousin remediate it for many thousands of dollars. You have those kinds of guys out there, and this is why you want to surround yourself with people who are both honest and knowledgeable. So, what it doesn't do, mold is not a flesh-eating bacteria, and it doesn't make your face tingle. What it does do is it makes your lungs irritated. Me personally, when I get into a room that has a lot of mold, it will tighten my chest up very quickly, and I will start sneezing. I am still a child, but that's what my wife says, but I'm not exceptionally old, not really young, I don't have cancer, and so I'm one of those normal, healthy adults who is affected to perhaps a somewhat greater level by mold spores. Can happen to all of us, some of us obviously more sensitive than others.